Many people think that there exist reliable, nonverbal behavioral cues that can help detect deception and tell liars from truth tellers. But as I've covered on this podcast several times in the past, there's no evidence for that. Not when we're talking about practically useful reads of deception or truth-telling in a general population, and when we're leaving aside person-specific reads. I was scrolling through LinkedIn recently and I saw a post by David Matsumoto, who's a well-known behavior researcher and the head of HumanTell, a company that says that they can help you, quote, master the skills to read behavior, decode motivation, and lead high-stakes conversations, whether you're hiring, interviewing, negotiating, or managing teams, end quote. In this LinkedIn post of his, he shared a paper that he'd co-written titled Behavioral Indicators of Deception and Associated Mental States, Scientific Myths and Realities. In that paper, they pushed back on the consensus view that there are no nonverbal behavioral cues useful for detecting deception. I'll read from the abstract of that paper. We suggest a reconsideration of broad and sweeping claims that research has demonstrated that nonverbal behavior are not indicators of deception. We re-examine several methodological characteristics of a seminal meta-analysis that is often cited as non-evidence and caution the field from drawing overgeneralized conclusions about the role of nonverbal behavior as indicators of deception based on that re-examination, end quote. The gist of the paper was that while single nonverbal behaviors haven't been shown to be useful, there's evidence that shows that combinations of multiple nonverbal behaviors may be highly reliable. At the end of the paper, they mention their conflict of interest, saying the authors are employees of HumanTell, a company that engages in research and training related to behavioral indicators of mental states and deception. This got me interested in digging into this topic more. Is there actually evidence that combinations of nonverbal behavior are useful for detecting deception? I had not heard that. If so, what were these combinations? What's the scientific evidence? I've talked to Tim Levine a couple previous times for this podcast. Tim is a highly respected researcher on deception detection. I'll read a little from his website, which is at timothy-levine.squarespace.com. His expertise involves the topics of lying and deception, truth default theory, interpersonal communication skills, credibility assessment and enhancement, interrogation, persuasion/influence, and social scientific research methods. He's the author of the book Duped, Truth Default Theory and the Social Science of Lying and Deception. And my first talk with Tim was about the ideas in that book, focusing on his truth default theory. Topics Tim and I discuss in this talk include: is it true that combinations of nonverbal behavioral cues can help us detect deception? The fact that so many papers finding certain behaviors correlated with deception or truth-telling have failed to replicate? Are microexpressions a thing? Are they actually useful? If you're interested in serious researched views on behavior and not the bullshit takes on behavior that are so popular these days on various YouTube channels, I think you'll enjoy this talk. If you like this talk, I think you'd like the other couple talks that I had with Tim about behavior and deception detection. Also, just want to say sorry about my noisy audio. I recently moved to New York City and don't have a great audio setup, so that's definitely made my audio much worse than it used to be. Okay, here's the talk with Tim Levine. Hi, Tim. Thanks for joining me again.
Happy to be here. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you again. The reason I had reached out to you was I happened to see this study by David Matsumoto, basically kind of defending the idea that, pushing back on the idea that nonverbal behavior is not a useful tool for detecting deception. And I got the gist of it seemed to be that he was saying some studies seemed to show that maybe using multiple nonverbal behaviors could be more useful than using, a single nonverbal behavior. But I'm curious overall, what were your thoughts on that paper and the overall ideas in it?
So first, let's not call it a study. Let's call it
A paper.
a paper or an essay or a commentary or an argument. So it's no new data. But I think you framed the claim pretty well. Um, Maybe we could give a more generous conclusion to them that maybe the verdict's not in yet. Um, so maybe there's a lot of findings that seem to suggest that nonverbal behaviors in particular aren't very useful in deception detection. But it might be that if studies were done differently, then more supportive findings might emerge. And while I think that's counterfactual at this current point in time, it's true. You never know what the next study's going to find or next finding's going to find.
Right. It was basically just saying it's possible that if you link together multiple nonverbal behaviors, which makes sense, like in theory, if more information, more data about someone could theoretically lead you to better conclusions, right? But I'm curious, yeah, what are your thoughts on that with your knowledge of the field about what, because they mentioned some previous studies and
Mm-hmm.
meta-analysis that they said seemed to show that, there was one that they mentioned. What was it? The
Hartwig and Bond,
Yeah, the
2014, I
Hartwig.
believe.
Yeah, Hartwig and Bond. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that and the idea that, I guess the quote was something. What was the quote? It was like that lies can be detected with 70% accuracy. I had a hard time parsing what they meant by that because it seemed kind of theoretical to me.
Yeah, that is a true finding, and it might actually be a little higher than 72%. But let me. This is going to take like a lot of
Yeah, I
unpacking.
get. I think there's a lot of unpacking, which is I found it hard to understand what exactly they were saying with my, not great parsing of academic papers and such.
Yeah. So the Hartwig and Bond study was a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is a study of studies, and they were um, looking at um, how diagnostic cues were. So there weren't any humans in the equation, right? It was if you do statistical modeling based on observed behaviors, how good could your algorithm be, right? So imagine we're on camera right now. So in modern technology, we could have cameras capturing all our facial movements and mapping those dynamically over time, right? And we could use machine learning um, to map what we're saying onto our facial expressions, theoretically, right? And then the algorithm could test if your blinking rates are faster when you're listening than when you're talking, for example. And it might be that in any given segment of communication, these things would appear diagnostic of listening versus talking.
I guess I'm confused. How could they put a number on it that exactly that 70% number approximately that they chose?
There is a statistic called multiple discriminant analysis. And if you've ever heard of regression, it's kind of like regression, but it's predicting a dichotomous outcome. So what you're doing is you're putting in enough of a bunch of predictors, and then you're weighting them to maximize predictability. And then what you can do is do a classification based on that. It was invented by, my understanding is, by anthropologists, physical anthropologists, who were trying to predict what kind of animals came from a discovered bone. So if you know, like, this characteristic of the bone and this characteristic of the bone and this characteristic of the bone, what probability is it that it's this dinosaur versus this dinosaur? Um, but the plot thickens.
Okay.
And I actually I should be able to pull the year off. I actually wrote a paper uh, based on this, because there's these two apparently really super inconsistent findings. There's the famous DiPaolo et al. 2003 meta-analysis of cues, which have analyzed cues individually. And that meta-analysis found that the vast majority of cues don't have any diagnostic value. The ones that do, their diagnostic value is statistically relevant, but practically useless.
Right. Very low, like meaning that they're statistically significant, but the usefulness, even if that's true, the usefulness is extremely low.
In any given communication, they would be useful in classifying large numbers of people at rates better than chance.
And also, it might be worth mentioning too, the 2003 study you mentioned, the meta-analysis, was a big part of what the paper we started out talking about, the Matsumoto one, was pushing back on that, because the 2003 paper was largely what people point to when they say nonverbal behaviors aren't a good correlation with deception detection. Yeah.
And they are right that you shouldn't be looking at nonverbal behaviors individually. And my whole work on demeanor points to this. That behaviors, it's global impressions that influence judgments and not specific behaviors. So there's really strong evidence for problems with looking at cues individually. So in the DiPaolo study, they looked at individual cues and the effects over studies. Right? So if you're testing, I don't know, how many details there are in a statement. The finding is that on average, honest people have higher number of details. Honest things tend to have higher number of details than deceptive things, at least given in the type of scenarios that have been tested in the study. Right, so that you test that difference in details or in blinks or in eye gaze, study over study. And what the DiPaolo analysis shows is some studies find one thing and some findings are incredibly mixed. And when you average them out, the more times a given cue has been studied, the more it tends to average to zero, no diagnosticity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, so even if it starts out in the previous study showing like something useful about it, it tends to revert down to the mean.
And it doesn't just get smaller. In order to revert to zero, it has to flip signs, right? So it has to be diagnostic and then anti-diagnostic. And when you average those, it comes to zero, right? So a nonverbal behavior might mean one thing in a given instance of communication and an exact opposite thing in the next.
And when you say it means something, are you saying it was theoretically actually a good predictor within that situation, but not later?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the unit of analysis, so to speak, in the DiPaolo study was the individual cue that was studied over time. So in the Hartwick and Bond, the unit of analysis was the individual study. So they looked at studies that studied some number of cues, right? And they found that in virtually all cue studies, find support for some cue. It doesn't mean it's the same cue, but they find effects for some cue. Because they're studying a lot of these are studying 10, 20 different things. And in almost every study, one pops, or two pops, or three pops. So what they find is there's really, really big cue effects at the level of the individual study. If you study those same cues over time, you find those effects go away. But you only see that when you study the same cue. The
Right.
Hartwick and Bond study is any cue,
Yeah.
right? So this creates a paradox. So how is it that individual studies are always finding effects, but those effects never replicate when you follow up on them, right? So in the Hartwig and Bond, I might have mistakenly said Bond and DiPaolo. That's a different one. The Hartwig and Bond multiple Q study, the one we're talking about, um, they're just tracking the biggest effects in individual studies and then averaging those effects, but they're not tracking which Q was being diagnostic there.
Right.
And so when you look at the average diagnosticity in studies that study multiple Q, it's better than 70% because all Q studies pretty much find support, right? And if there's publication bias in the literature and there's a bias towards publishing studies that find support, then people are, right? So
Right.
presumably they're testing all these different variables, right? They're finding one that pops. And in the Hartwig and Bond, it wasn't multiple Qs weren't that much better than single Qs.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Right.
So
Okay.
the multiple Q effect was a zero point 0.5. The single Q effect was a zero point 0.4.
Mm-hmm.
This is in units of correlation. So 80% of the effect is be driven by one Q. But
Mm.
we know from the DiPaolo
Mm.
data that that one Q isn't reliable across studies,
Right.
right? So what this means is if you are, this lets people cherry pick studies because you can find support for anything, right? And this is why it's so important to replicate research and look across studies and look at the pattern.
Right. So this study, the one we're talking about, the Hartwig and Bond one,
Mm-hmm.
that Matsumoto references, the using more than one
Mm-hmm.
nonverbal behavior. You're saying they're basically just using the most rosy, optimistic picture and not factoring in the fact that those results, when you actually do more work on each of those things that pop, those things tend to revert to meaningless or near meaningless. So
Yeah,
it's a
but
distorted
it's
view of they're taking a very rosy picture of what you can do with that data, and it's not reflecting the reality of how weak those things actually are. Yeah.
yeah, but I think we should be more generous because it's easy to see a finding, right, and go, oh, and especially if that finding fits what you wish were true, right, and it is legit. They're not quoting the study wrong. What they are doing though is they're leaving context out,
Right.
and there's an even bigger context they're leaving out here, which is if you dig into the findings deeper. So it's Matsumoto and Wilson start out their argument by using a form of argument I would call I'll blame the methods, right? And the argument goes if only the studies were done differently and had these different methodological features, then surely the data would support, right? So in the Hartwig and Bond study, they tested what are called moderators or these various methodological culprits that are proposed in the Matsumoto and Wilson paper. And what they find is there's always large Q effects, whether lies are high stakes or low stakes, or regardless of all of these things. So it doesn't matter how many Qs you're looking at, it doesn't matter whether it's high stakes or low stakes. Q studies, individual Q studies find big effects, right? So if you dig into the details of their analysis, right, there's actually findings in that paper that undercut their argument.
Mm. Can you summarize that in like a layman's terms, for because I think that might be it might be hard to understand all that you said. Maybe you could summarize it in a couple languages about how it undercuts it.
Yeah, so Hypothetical example. Let's say we thought that eye blinks were only diagnostic in employment interviews and not interpersonal lies. Okay? And all the studies had been, the argument is all the studies were done in interpersonal lies. So if only you had done them in employment lies, you would have seen the effect. But the studies included in Hartwig and Bond's meta-analysis include both types,
Right, I
and
see
the
what you're saying.
findings were the same either way.
Yeah, so they're trying to criticize the methods, but yet, regardless
But
of the methods, there are
the
spikes.
studies that they're later going to support in support of their claim actually tested that and found that didn't matter.
Right, right.
And that undercuts the argument of the paper.
Which is an interesting thing about the stakes thing, because some people will say, if only the stakes were higher and more like real life situations, you'd be catching more correlations or imbalances and such.
And this is an incredibly plausible argument.
Yeah.
It goes back to the original Ekman stuff. And people believe this. People buy this. But it makes great intuitive sense.
Right. It's also interesting, though, that you can think of another logical thing where it's like, theoretically, the lower stakes situations would be more likely to find imbalances because the liars in the high stakes situations have more incentive to act like the non-liars, right? So you can kind of reason at it both ways.
Or maybe there's even more sophisticated ones, like the type of people who put themselves in the situations where there's high stake cases, right? Are the people who are the better, better bluffers.
Right.
Because if I can't bluff, I don't play poker.
Right. Yeah. And then there's also things like, people have talked about, are college students good examples of general population people? Are they the, fitting people to study? So there is all this discussion
about
methodologies. Yeah. Right.
And it always runs into this, as I describe it in my book, Duped, this circular argument where you didn't find what I think you should have.
Right.
Therefore, you didn't do your study right.
Right.
I know you didn't do your study right because you didn't find what I thought you were going to find.
Right. Which is a problem with so many theories and theory, firm believers of ideas who,
And none of this, for your listeners, none of this means that the conclusions from the research might completely turn around in the next 10 years. Right? We never know what the next study is going to find until we do it. Right? And there might be something that's been overlooked. Somebody might have been, I've made my whole career on finding things other people have overlooked. Right? And turning over those stones and going, look what we found. I don't know that the next time I turn over a stone, anything's going to be there, right? And I certainly don't have any kind of superpower or lock on being the one who, can find stuff.
Yeah.
So
you're just looking at what comes up. Yeah.
Nature is what nature is, right? How we look at it, things definitely shape how we understand them, right? And until we do something, we don't know.
Yeah, and there's with all this AI machine learning stuff, there theoretically are things that might be found. I mean, I interviewed someone, I don't know if you probably saw about this study by Dino Levy and his team that used some machine learning stuff to monitor facial muscles and claim to have a 73% deception detection rate.
Oh, this is right. I know that this is exactly what Hartwig and Bond will say will happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter what you're looking at, right? You use the machine learning stuff to look at any package of variables. On average, you're going to get 73% accuracy. And it doesn't matter what the content is. It doesn't matter what the variables are, right? It seems like you always get that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when I interviewed him and looked at that study, I'll admit I didn't find it very convincing that it was going to be replicatable or anything, and especially it seemed kind of iffy with what exactly the machine learning was doing, because some of these things are kind of a little black boxes. Like, it wasn't clear to me what the algorithm was even detecting, because it seemed, and it might, it could theoretically have been me not understanding it, but it seemed like I had a hard time even understanding what he had said that the algorithm had even detected. So, uh, yeah, just to say, like,
Yeah.
probably like you are, I'm
So
skeptical
so
whether a lot of these things would replicate. Yeah.
yeah, and that there's a word for that, and it's called cross validation. So let's take it in a completely different context. Imagine Amazon was trying to model our purchase behavior. Um, and there's all kinds of things that are going on the page, right? When we look at something and they know whether we click buy or not, right? So they could have their AI or their machine learning start plotting out with what features of the page get us to click and what don't. Okay, so they get that algorithm. Now let's say we took that algorithm and applied it to new customers with new projects. How well does it do in predicting? That's cross-validation.
Right. Right. To ensure you're not just getting noise and randomness spikes. And
Yeah. So here's another example. When I did my demeanor work, and for the listeners who don't know, this is on how cues aren't in isolation. People present things, and behaviors all are presented in a package. And these packages are all intercorrelated. So I came up with a set of 11 behaviors that and impressions that seem to predict really well whether somebody's going to be believed or disbelieved. Those are completely independent of whether they're lying or not, right? But we know who gets believed and who doesn't. And they're basically being friendly, confident, and outgoing, right? Whereas people who are anxious or awkward tend not to be believed.
Related to your
And
truth default theory.
yeah, related to truth.
Yeah.
And these things, so I documented that these 11 particular behaviors and impressions seem to be the believability quotient. So I had these. So what I did is I collected a whole different sample of truth tellers and liars, coded those for these behaviors, had a whole different sample of participants, rate them for honesty, had a whole different sample of people, judge them for these behaviors, and then showed that the judgments of the behaviors predicted the judgments of honesty with these separate groups of people on a whole new set of communicators.
Right. Cross
Right?
validation.
And cross validation. And when I did that, then I went, oh, I think I'm onto something. But until I did that, we would never know if the findings were idiosyncratic to that particular samples or coders or method. Right?
Yeah, because so is it your view, am I understanding it right, that like when they get these spikes that, don't replicate these findings, correlations, do you think in some of these situations the things that they found actually were good predictors for that specific situation and set of factors of whatever sort? Like, if they had ran that same situation multiple times, even some of the findings might be related to that specific situation and the types of people in it or things like this? Or do you think most of it is entirely just kind of random spikes? If that makes sense, if that question makes
I
sense.
think all of the above.
Yeah, it's a mix. Yeah.
So I did a study kind of way back in 205, where I was trying to train people to read nonverbal behaviors and then see if this would make them more accurate. And I, of course, predicted that it wouldn't. Um, but the gimmick of the study was including a placebo control. So one group of people were assigned to read that the best meta-analysis of the time behaviors. That was Zuckerman et al. In 81. They were trained to do the behaviors that were the most diagnostic from that meta-analysis. And that kind of got overturned by DiPaolo in 2003. But I trained them on that. And then another group got trained on 5 behaviors that should have no validity from that meta-analysis. And then the third, the control group, didn't get any training at all. And in the first study, what we found is the people who got trained in the nothing cues did the best. And the people who got trained in the valid cues did the worst, with the control group in the middle, which is absolutely befuddling. So then what we did is we went to the particular truth tellers and liars and coded the nonverbal cues we were training. And we found that for those particular samples, the things that weren't diagnostic in meta-analysis actually were diagnostic. And the things that were diagnostic in the research weren't. So then we went back and trained to do things that were person, message, situation specific. And we found when we trained to do that, it made people 2% better. It improved them from 56% to 58%. But in that coding, what I learned is, within a situation which was constant, there were big differences between people. And there were also within people distances between utterance and utterance. Right? So what might be diagnostic in one snippet might not be in the next. And this is a real complicated combination of person, situation, and variability, not only across people, but within people. Because people just aren't that constant.
Right.
If we were coding your number of blinks during this interview, you're not blinking at a set rate. Right? Depending on where we snip the tape, we're going to find you going, right, and me going like this.
We're very complex.
Yeah. So the way I think about it, so I tend to think Q findings are real in the sense that they are real in the data that showed them. Right? They are not at all robust. That is, they don't extend very well within person to different situations, across people, even from moment to moment. So cues are, as I think of them, ephemeral. And this is why it's easy if I'm selling you on a lie detecting method that I can point to cue examples where they work. Because you can see cues in everyday communication. Right? And if you pick situations in which your preferred cue actually works, right, then you can show great examples on video. But the trouble is those things tend not to extend. They might flip and do the exact opposite thing in the next instance.
So if I had to summarize your view of Matsumoto's argument, the paper we started talking about at the beginning, I'd imagine your view is basically like, yeah, theoretically, there's you could there could be some findings in future that are replicatable and show that more than multiple nonverbal cues might be highly correlated with deception, but we haven't seen anything like that. There's no specific evidence for anything like that.
A little bit more subtle. There's lots of evidence for that. There's not a lot of evidence that holds up across studies in very kind of predictable, reliable ways.
Gotcha. Okay.
So at the level of the individual study, yes, absolutely. Across studies in ways that I'm really comfortable relying on, not yet. But I agree with him that the verdict is not, and it shouldn't be, entirely in yet. Because if you just, oh, this is a dead end and nobody researches it anymore, we'll never know if it really should have been a dead end, right? So I try not to. Um, I think people can test whatever hypotheses they want, and I think it's good that there's difference of views and people are pursuing different things. And I think in the long run, this is going to put us in a lot better scientific position than we would be if there was just one orthodoxy and everybody had to follow it.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, I
just
know
for,
that's not hugely satisfying.
well, just from a like a logical perspective, it seems, when you think about, I mean, humans can control their behavior a lot. So if there was some, say it came out that there was some major combination of behaviors that were known to be, decently tied to deception, it would just become that most the word would get around and people would try not to do those things. Sort of like we know that liars don't want to do various things that they think are tied to deception, right? Like, so there's just to say humans are very complex. If there's something we can do to, adjust our behavior to help ourselves, we will. So it makes you think, like, if there are going to be reliable signs of deception, they would have to be things that you couldn't control, but even in that realm, like, heartbeat and these kinds of, galvanic skin response and stuff, even that stuff, we know isn't reliable because you can get excited for various reasons and get nervous for various reasons. So just to say, there's various reasons I'm not to say, like you, I'm open minded that they could find some combination that's, for a general
Yeah,
population is, yeah,
but I'm in clearly camp skeptical
yeah, clearly,
about the
yeah.
about the Q thing. And if I was when I'm investing in what I'm going to put my time and effort to in my lab, um, I'm not trying to save Qs. Um, I'm investing my time and energy in different directions. So I think people can invest in whatever they want, um, but that's not. I I think there's enough of a data story out there to suggest that um, uh, different paths are going to be more fruitful.
We don't have to talk about this if you don't want, but do you have any thoughts on, I mean, Matsumoto is, clearly tied to this company that he's the head of, Human Tell, which sells courses on, getting people
Mm-hmm.
better at reading people and corporate or personal, situations, basically. So, and as he says in his study, his papers that he puts out,
Yeah.
that's obviously a conflict of interest. But I'm curious, do you have anything to say about that? And understand that's not, something we need to get into.
Um, my interactions with David have been like super positive. Um, he's done like some really cool studies, like with blind athletes and stuff. I think he's done some uh, really good science. I think um, the conflict of interests are always a concern, but he seems to be very open about disclosing those. Um, so, um, yeah,
Uh,
that's
I noticed on his site, the Human Tell site. I was just looking at the Human Tell
yeah.
site
Oh,
today.
the other thing is, he's an Ekman protege,
Right, I noticed they
and
collaborated. Yeah,
there's
we've talked about Ekman before on a previous
yeah,
episode. Yeah,
and so in kind of academics, a good rule of thumb is don't speak badly about other people's advisors or mentors, because you know, just like you wouldn't want to say bad things about people's parents or favorite sports stars, or it's okay to have a viewpoint, and um, right.
yeah, and
But it's good that those things are disclosed.
yeah, and I'll put it. I'll probably put in a note about the previous episode if people are curious about our previous discussions about this. But I'm curious. While I have you here, I have been thinking about the micro expressions thing recently, and I'm a big skeptic about the micro expressions and the usefulness of them. Do you have are there I assume you're would be a pretty big skeptic too, but is there a study that you'd point to, or a favorite study or two that shows skepticism, why skepticism is warranted about the micro expressions?
Not ones that I could pull the sites to off the top of my head.
Or do you have maybe
Um,
just share your thoughts on the overall idea of their practicality, practical use?
um, my understanding is um, there's some debate on whether microexpressions are a thing or not. But at least some people, some of the time, seem to do microexpressions. Um, saying that they mean this or they mean that, um, outside of maybe revealing a particular emotion, I think is probably pretty tricky. Um, I I think most of the researchers right now are pretty skeptical about microexpressions. I think now that machine learning is good enough to do facial recognition and track microexpressions, I think that we're going to see a whole bunch of studies applying that methodology to find just what Hartwig and Bond found about every cue is that um, they're diagnostic of something. Um, Whether or not that something holds up over time is a different story.
Yeah, I'd say I've thought about them a good amount when I learned about them, and I mean I've looked for them in poker, never found any real use for them. If anything, I find that the little expressions are the opposite, because in a competitive situation,
Mm-hmm.
there's actually an instinct for somebody to act the reverse of what they are, right? So if you see tiny signs of somebody looking uncertain or worried, who's made a big bet, that's actually like highly correlated with them being relaxed and strong. So just to say, and but I think that's an interesting thing, because it kind of maps over to some writing I've seen on like micro expressions and deception detection and interrogations and such, where I think there's some study that found that truth tellers actually are more likely to have signs of contempt and these kinds of things that most people would associate with liars. But there's like different ways to look at it, because you can make up logical reasons why they would be present for liars and truth tellers, because truth tellers are more relaxed, so they might be more willing to let their contempt and other negative emotions show, or you might reason it the other way and say liars are more likely to, just to say there can be many ways to try to explain findings of whatever sort, right? So, but I'll say, yeah, I've long been skeptical about micro expressions, because if they were something I would have expected to find, see more of them in poker, basically. But I don't haven't made use of them, basically. So yeah, thanks for that.
A good place to test them might be in amateur poker.
Hmm, yeah, I think the well, I do think the
Really novice poker players
yeah,
might be a
maybe.
fun.
Although I do think yeah, we could talk about this for a while, because you and I have talked about I've
So
talked
I'm
about
not
the
saying
difference
that they
between
would
the
be diagnostic,
yeah
but you might see a lot more variability. Um,
yeah the interesting thing about the poker and other formal kind of competitive game and situations is that there's this assumed competitive environment, so people are more likely to try to put on, they're not even necessarily trying to deceive. It's like an instinctual thing to put on the opposite of what they are,
mhm.
in a game environment, which to me has no correlation to like interrogations or real world interviews, because there's not a directly competitive situation where you're trying to get somebody to do a specific thing, right? So it's a very, yeah. I think it's interesting how different the areas are between a fully competitive spot versus a non competitive real world spot. But yeah, uh, So I was curious. I'll let you go shortly, but I was curious. Do you want to share any other interesting things you're working on these days? Projects?
No, I think there's probably a bunch in the works, but right now they're sufficiently underdeveloped to be ready for public broadcast. Although I do have a recent paper with Dave Markowitz out of Michigan State on asking AI to try to detect deception.
Oh, interesting. Okay, what's the
And it
name of
was
that?
so it's published in Journal of Communication. And David Markowitz, you're asking a dyslexic how to spell.
Oh, well,
Um,
what's the paper? Is there? If can they find it online, or can I link to it?
you probably can, or I can send it to you.
Okay, I'll put it in the
Um,
show notes for this. Yeah.
but this was a video platform that could listen to audio and watch video.
Okay. Interesting.
And the finding was it was more biased than humans.
Okay, I want to read this. Wow, sounds interesting.
So it was more context dependent than humans were, but in kind of very stereotypically biased ways.
hmm hmm Cool. I want to read that.
Yeah, I'll have to remember to send it to you.
Yeah.
So um, that's kind of my big, most recently published work
Very cool.
that I think will get some traction.
Yeah. Then I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of interesting AI related
Yeah,
studies and papers.
but we want to be super careful with the results of that paper because AI technology is changing daily, right? So the findings are very much tied to one particular platform at one particular point in time.
That is true. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Things are changing so rapidly. Yeah. Uh, so for people that are interested in your work that like this talk, what's the best way? Is there a book of yours you'd recommend them getting started with?
uh, yeah, I have one book on the topic. It's called Duped:
hmm
Truth, Fault Theory, and the Social Science of Lying and Deception. Uh, that is, it's an academic press book, so it's a little nerdy,
hmm
but it's nothing, that people can't work through.
Yeah, I found it
I,
quite
I would tell
readable.
them to read the reviews on Amazon.com. They're super informative.
Mm.
So, all the academics say, this is so easy to read. This is right. and, and some of the non-academics are like, oh, numbers.
I found it, for what it's worth. I found it quite readable, and I think for those kind of books, if you can always skim over the really heavy stuff and get to the more explanatory things
Yeah.
if you want to
And
read a book
even
like
and
that.
even when there are numbers, there's text in there that tells you what all the numbers mean.
hmm 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 well, thanks, Tim. This has been great. Thanks again
Oh,
for
it's always a pleasure, Zach.
yeah, really appreciate it.
Thanks for reaching out.
Thank you. Yeah.
And always nice to talk to you. And I hadn't seen the Matsumoto and Wilson article until you pointed it to me. So
Oh, nice. Yeah. Glad I could.
that's always good to keep up on the literature.
Nice. Glad I could help a little bit. Okay. Thanks a lot. That was a talk with Tim Levine. I'm Zach Elwood, and this has been the People Who Read People podcast. You can learn more about it at behavior-podcast.com. Thanks for listening. Music by Small Skies.